This morning begins a new series of messages that will go through the month of November, and this is kind of a harvest and a stewardship series. We are talking this morning about the cost of being a disciple. We're going to be in Luke chapter 14, and as we did last week, I want you to grab that Bible in front of you. I want you to see what Jesus said and not just listen to me talk about it. We need to make sure we understand, if He is Lord, that He's giving us these instructions, and we are taking them to heart. So I'll give you a moment just to prepare to turn to Luke, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the third book in the New Testament, chapter 14. We'll be starting at verse 25. This is the first in a new series, a fall series here, on working the harvest or ignoring the field. We only have one choice. We have two options, but one choice: to work the harvest or ignore the field. Now, some plans work out perfectly. When it comes to spaceflight, Sputnik was the first satellite to be placed in any type of orbit. It happened by Russia or by the Soviet Union at the time in 1957. And now today we have independent space agencies. The best known one is SpaceX. And they are doing commercial launches. They have had some failures, but there have been hundreds and hundreds of successful space missions since 1957. However, some plans would go spectacularly wrong. Let me give you a list of 5. In August 2008, NASA destroyed an unmanned experimental rocket that was launched from Wallops Island, Virginia. It was carrying a pair of research satellites worth millions of dollars, but the rocket veered off course, and they were afraid that it was going to come crashing back down to land in a populated area, and so they hit the switch and destroyed it while it was still up in the air. On February 3rd, 2003, the Columbia shuttle, which had a wing damage during its launch, broke apart in the Texas skies on re-entry, killing all 7 of the astronauts and raining its debris over Texas and Louisiana. On January 28, 1986, the Space Shuttle Challenger exploded over Cape Canaveral in Florida just seconds after liftoff. 7 crew members were killed. And the manned space program was in jeopardy from that time on. They weren't sure if they were ever going to be able to send anyone back up into space. In April of 1970, when they were 4/5 of the way to the moon, Apollo 13 was crippled when a tank containing liquid oxygen burst open. The 3 astronauts on board the Apollo spacecraft survived by moving into the lunar module until they were able to fly the main vessel safely back to the Earth. They slingshot around the moon and came back. And on January 27, 1967, a flash fire, because of the amount of oxygen used in the space capsule, erupted on the Apollo 1 spacecraft during a routine launch pad test. And all 3 of those Apollo astronauts were killed. Now, with hundreds of successful launches and missions completed, what makes the difference between those successes and those spectacular failures? Jesus gives us some perspective on the difference between success and failure in Luke chapter 14. We're going to start at verse 25, and we're going to be reading through verse 33. And as we read this, we'll see that Jesus tells a few of his parables, his stories, to illustrate his point. Luke 14:25 says, "Large crowds were traveling with Jesus, and turning to them, he said, 'If anyone comes to me and does not hate his father and mother, wife and children, brother and sisters, yes, even his own life, such a person cannot be my disciple. And whoever does not carry their cross and follow me cannot be my disciple.' Suppose one of you wants to build a tower. Won't you first sit down and estimate the cost to see if you have enough money to complete it? For if you lay the foundation and are not able to finish it, everyone who sees it will ridicule you, saying, 'This person began to build and wasn't able to finish.' Or suppose a king is about to go to war against another king. Won't he first sit down and consider whether he is able with 10,000 men to oppose the one coming against him with 20,000? If he is not able, he will send a delegation while the other army is still a long way off, and he will ask for terms of peace. In the same way, those of you who do not give up everything you have cannot be my disciple. Do we think we are disciples? Let me remind you, a disciple is a follower. Not the apostles, but all who follow Jesus are to be considered disciples. And Jesus was speaking to a huge crowd, and he said, you cannot be a follower of mine if you don't hate your family, if you don't hate your own life, if you don't carry a cross, and if you don't count the cost. He was really laying it out on the line. And he wanted them to understand three things. First of all, the difference comes because there's planning. Imagine you're a newspaper editor, and this passage from Luke 14 is handed to you, and you are instructed as the newspaper editor to come up with an appropriate headline, something that's going to grab attention. Have you ever noticed some headlines really steer you wrong? They could be on Facebook, they could be on MSN, they could be on any of the apps for any of the news companies, or the news media outlets. It could be in our local paper, and sometimes the headline makes you scratch your head. Well, you read through this passage, and you recall that Jesus is making some colossal demands, so large that some people were frustrated at him. He said in verse 26, whoever comes to me and does not hate his mother, his wife, his children, his brothers, his sisters, and even his own life cannot be my disciple. But Jesus went on to give some very practical wisdom on how to undertake this ability to do what he wants us to do. He said, you need to be prepared if you're going to go into battle. You need to be prepared if you're going to build a tower. And so, as the newspaper editor, you come up with this spectacular headline, Planning and Paying. Well, you know, if I saw the headline, Planning and Paying, I might just pass on the article. It didn't grab my attention. But planning and paying can be one of the most motivational headlines around. It may be great for someone who is a chief financial officer of a large business, but is it going to fire the imagination of the average reader? Or is it going to fire the imagination of the Christian on the idea that we need to plan and we need to pay? Will it help us to proclaim the gospel of Jesus Christ? Will it aid us in a means of being able to minister to the poor and the needy and the hungry and the neglected? Planning and paying. What's that about? Let's unpack the idea. Let's look at why planning and paying is an appropriate headline for this story. The whole corporate world, the world of schools and education, and even the church, they're all caught up in the language of planning and strategy and looking forward. But guess what? Jesus was into some of that as well. And it's illustrated right here in these two stories. When we look at Luke's gospel, we see that Jesus is very clear about plans and strategy that need to be put into place. This is an all-embracing vision that affects what we do before we start. It affects how we can give. So let's think about what God has shown, how God has shown himself as a great planner. He has a vested interest in planning and in its consequences. After all, he was the one to love this creation into existence. He was the one to plan to give us this world. He is the one who decided that this one globe in all the universe would inhabit life. And then he made humans to oversee it. There's a lot of planning that goes on there. There's a lot of strategy that goes on there. And so we find ourselves looking at God, who is the planner. We also see that he gave us free will. And in giving us free will, he gave us the ability to choose whether to follow him or not to follow him. And when we chose not to follow him, we wound up following evil. And there was a blackness there. There was a sin there. We sang about that needed to be removed. We couldn't remove it ourselves. And so God had a plan. I will send my son. He will take your sin away. He will bear it to a cross. He will die for what you deserve to die for. And so the cost is extraordinary. God's plan was that we would be able to live with him and for him, and we would be able to share what he has. And we blew it. And so he said, here's the way out. I'm going to pay even more and let my son take your sin away. God has given everything for our lives, for our faith, and for our trust. That's been his plan. That's been his strategy. Now, it's funny how in our own lives we plan a number of things, but then there's other things we just don't plan. It's worth thinking about, of what we plan and what we don't plan for. For instance, many people plan to provide for themselves in their old age. They plan their monthly incomes so that they can take care of their obligations and their bills. And they even plan to save for holidays and save for Christmas. But when have we ever heard someone sitting down in the morning and marking down how many times they plan to breathe that day? Well, that's one. That's two. We don't think about that. That's natural. That's a given. That's something we all do, and we take it for granted, and every breath we breathe into our lungs is a gift from God. He planned it. He provided for it. He gave us the means to live and to thrive. Have you ever heard of an unborn child listening to the doctor speak to his mother through the womb, and the doctor says, I believe the due date is August 5th. And so scratching on the wall of the womb, the child decides, August 5th, that's so many days away. Okay, I'm going to plan. I'm going to come out on August 5th. Does that happen? No. We had one daughter born 3 weeks early. We had one son born 2 weeks late. And I'll be dogged if Kalita didn't stand on her head in the garden on the due date trying to get Josh to come out, but he wasn't ready. There's some things we can't plan. There's some things we just simply take for granted because nature is going to take its course. Now, it seems like money is something we can plan for and plan with, but when it comes to receiving the gifts of God, the breath of life, he gives those graciously, but we unknowingly receive them and don't even pay attention to it. You see, God is the one who has planned all this. And so we need to understand, because he has planned all this, he secondly has made strategy an important aspect of this kind of life that we have. Plans without strategy will never come to fruition. Strategy without goals will be useless exercises. Planning and strategy have to be made real, and they have to be workable. Now, we all know dreamers. There are people who can dream dreams and have great visions and say, I envision this church being able to move into a facility that will be filled to the brim and seat 500 or more people. I envision this church having a daycare center. I envision this church opening up some type of Christian school. And yeah, those are great ideas. How are we going to do it? Well, I don't know. I just envision it. You be the strategist. Well, that's not really going to work very well. There are people who will have their plans without a strategy. And then there are people who are so concerned about how it's going to be done that they count every penny of a project, so there's no room for vision. There's no room for inspiration. Now, there's nothing more disheartening than a visionary idea that's deflated by a person who is even more than a realist. They are simply a sourpuss. Meanness is disheartening because it contrasts so strongly with the generosity of God. God has been so generous to us. And he gives us ideas, but he also says, work those ideas out. Make sure when you have the idea to build the tower that you're going to have enough funds to complete it. God cannot help but being generous. He is overflowing. He is lavish. And we see these gracious words in Luke's gospel saying that plans need to be real and plans need to be tangible. After all, God's plans to love us back when we were absolutely horrid have come true. The scriptures say, when we were still sinning, Christ died for the ungodly. He didn't wait for us to get our act together. He died for us in our sin. That was God's plan. That was God's strategy. God worked it out. And so we, as followers of Jesus Christ, need to see how strategy works hand in hand with planning. The planning part of that newspaper headline has to also make sense when we acknowledge that God is opening us up to be generous. He has freely and He has generously given us our lives. He has given us that breath of air you just inhaled and that one you're exhaling right now. He provides in abundance. And He asks us to be generous with what He gives us. The cost, the payment comes in the way we worship God, in the way in which we are disciples and followers of Jesus Christ, in the way in which we are open to God's Word transforming our lives and our hearts, because the Lord is the giver of life. Jesus demands that we see generosity in a whole new way. We've got to look at it differently, folks. We have all met people who are so concerned about the bottom line and the bottom dollar that when someone comes up with a fabulous idea and they even have some strategy to follow along with it, first words, how much is this going to cost? I'm not here to shake our heads and tell us that we can't do these things that God would have us do. Because God is the giver of all that we have. He is the owner of cattle on 1,000 hills. This building is His. The shoes on your feet are His. The car that you drove to get here is His. The clothes in your back are His. And that lunch you're going to have when we're done is His. And He's given it all to us. Generosity is not like paying a bill. Generosity is not the grudging underwriting of some person's crazy scheme about how we can win people to Christ. No, generosity is only possible from people who have received generosity, and we have received the generosity of God. We're all beneficiaries of that. Every last one of us. All of life is a generous gift. And it's something none of us have asked for, but it's something we've all been given. And then on top of that, we have been saved from our sin to boot. Wow. So, how do we swallow Jesus' words about this kind of generosity when He started this out by saying, you got to hate your mother, you got to hate your father, you got to hate your brothers and sisters and your cousins, you got to hate your own life, you got to hate your possessions. What's He mean by that? It doesn't make sense for some people. But it does when we think about how generous we need to be. The problem we have in our day and age, and they had back in their day and age, is that we put blinders on and we only see the smaller picture. We concentrate on our own family. We concentrate on our own marriages. We concentrate on our own kids. We concentrate on the people closest to us, and we say, I don't have time for anything else. Or we concentrate on our own possessions, and we want to make sure that we've got our nest egg and our money is safe, and I don't have any room to share that with anyone else. And what Jesus is really saying is this. When I say you have to hate your parents and hate your spouse, and you have to hate your own life, and you have to carry a cross, He's saying there is such a broader picture. Open your eyes and see that the fields are ripe unto harvest. Open your eyes and see that there's so many more people to love. And there's so many more ways to give. And there's so many more ways to honor Christ who went to Calvary for us. That's what Jesus wants us to see when He's talking about planning and paying and strategy. That's what we need to do. The only thing that Jesus wants us to cling to in this life is the old rugged cross. We don't need to cling to our possessions. We don't need to cling to our savings accounts and to our retirement funds. We need to cling to Jesus Christ, not our cash and not our cousins. Now, that's exactly what the first Christians did again and again and again. Luke wrote this story about Jesus in Luke 14, but he also wrote the book of Acts. And in the book of Acts, after the church began, Luke said this in chapter 2. He said, all who believed had everything in common. They would sell their possessions and goods and distribute the proceeds to anyone who had need. You see, they had a practical response to this idea of being community, of loving each other, of reaching out to those in need. But it goes on. In Acts chapter 2, Luke said, day by day, they spent as much time as they could in the temple courts, and they broke bread in their homes and ate their food with glad and generous hearts. Some passage or some translations will say sincere hearts. But the idea of sincere hearts exhibit themselves through generosity. They were generous people. Our first step to being more generous is to be more thankful. That's where it starts. That's why this ties in with Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving isn't something we do just on the fourth Thursday of one month out of the year. Oh no, we need to be thankful for all things at all times in all ways. Do you still pray before every meal? Or is that something that's gone by the wayside? I would think that in our homes we probably still bow for a few seconds, but I know that some people are a little bit embarrassed if they were to bow in a public place and thank God for their food. Hey folks, little steps first. We can't do grand things until we learn to be thankful for little things. Might be time to start praying in public again. Might be time to let other people see us bow our heads because we are honoring the one who gave us the food in front of us. We can start there. This is what happened. The first church had the favor of all people, and day by day the Lord added to their number those who were being saved. That's also in Acts 2. Their generosity overflowed, their thanksgiving overflowed, their help with others overflowed, and God blessed them. We can't dryly talk about planning and paying. We need to be excited about planning and paying. Because God planned and God paid for us to have heaven. And so that leads us to the third part here, and that's the fact that we need to be looking forward. We need to plan. We need to not just plan, but we also need to be able to work out the situation, but we need to look forward. Over the next few weeks, we're going to explore different ways that Luke's gospel sparked those first Christians. They burned with generosity. And we're going to discover what can set us on fire with generosity as well. Brothers and sisters in Jesus Christ, our attitudes may be shaken and challenged during this series of messages, both as individuals and as a congregation. But at the heart of this whole business of Christian generosity and giving is the understanding that we can do nothing less than this to bring about God's kingdom. Our church needs to plan. Our church needs to pray. It needs to pay the bills, and it needs to pay for what we are to accomplish under God's will. The world is so full of darkness, and the world needs the light of Jesus Christ. That light comes when Christians who know what they have been given also know how to share that with other people. It's time, folks, to plan and pay. Planning and paying is not a dull headline. It opened up the context of Christian generosity. It opened up the context of being a disciple, a follower of Jesus. And it gives a whole new meaning to this idea of giving ourselves to Christ. We have the chance of getting our giving right when we get our discipleship right. Can I say that again? That was a mouthful, and I want you to digest that. We have the opportunity to get our giving right when we get our discipleship right, when we become the followers of Jesus Christ, as we should be, guess what's going to happen? We're not going to have a financial problem in this church because we are doing the work of God, and we're doing it gladly. Led by God, together we can plan, we can strategize, and we can look toward the future. But that will only happen when we give up and hand everything over to God. That's why Jesus said hate. He didn't mean hate. He meant don't concentrate on them and not look at the broader picture. That's what he meant when he said carry the cross. Remember what this story is about and what Jesus did for us. We live in a very suspicious, very cold, and very calloused world. And that suspicious, cold, and calloused world is desperately looking for what's right. The thing is, they don't know it. They don't realize that they're desperately looking for the right, and so they're trying everything to make them happy. They're trying drugs, and they're trying sex, and they're trying booze, and they're trying all sorts of things to make them happy. But what they need to see is a generous church worshiping a generous God by being good stewards, servants of all that we have been given. And it boils down to this, folks. We have the choice of doing one thing, two options. We can work the harvest, or we can ignore the field. The harvest is great. The crops need to come in. Those crops are souls. They need to be gathered to the kingdom of God. And it's up to us to either work the harvest or turn a blind eye and ignore the field that needs to be brought home. God has something magnificent in store for us as we would serve him. We just need to start. Take those baby steps and start. Honor him in all things. We invite you to come to Christ today. That's the first step you can make. If you don't know Jesus as your Lord and Savior, we invite you to make that decision, to know him, to obey him, and to live for him. And you can come forward as we stand and as we sing this song together. Let's stand.